The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Project Nerd as a whole.
I could let them know about the sorrow and the happiness that the future has in store for them. Maybe they could learn from it.
Let's dive deep.
Let's dive right in.
We're gonna dive deep into this.
Let's deep dive into this.
This is Diving Deep.
This is Diving Deep.
This is Diving Deep.
Racism, specifically institutional racism. You know, the thing that complacent conservatives are claiming is a myth because it makes them uncomfortable. This episode of Diving Deep will not be fun. It will not be entertaining. If you're looking for that, please check out one of the other amazing Project Nerd podcasts. This episode of Diving Deep will be educational, hopefully. In this special episode, we're going to take a look at what institutional racism is, the complacent rhetorics and myths getting in the way of our country fully acknowledging it exists, data to support its existence, and some thoughts on what we can do and how we can support marginalized communities impacted by it. Institutional racism defines states that, number one, it is a form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. It is reflected in disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other factors. And for good measures, number two, that's also defined as the laws and decisions in which the United States of fucking America is governed and policed by, apparently. This is an issue that no matter how many times it comes up, we as a country still don't get it. The death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the many others like them isn't a new phenomenon. This is an ongoing issue in this country, as real as mass shootings, overpriced healthcare, the coronavirus pandemic, and a president who doesn't know how to do his damn job. You know, the other conservative myths. Run the Jewels released their fourth studio album last week with songs written months, if not years ago. And in the song, Walking in the Snow, Killer Mike shared these lyrics. And every day on the evening news, they feed your fear for free. And you're so numb, you watch the cops choke out a man like me. Until my voice goes from a shriek to whisper, I can't breathe. And you sit there in the house on your couch and watch it on TV. The most you give's a Twitter rant and call it a tragedy. These lyrics paint the picture of what happened at the scene of George Floyd's death before the horrific event even occurred. That's because they weren't written about Floyd, but rather events that had happened prior. For those that think this isn't real, I really at this point don't even know what to say anymore. But I guess I'll try. If you don't think it's real because you're racist, as Tyler pointed out in this week's episode of the Nerdcast by Project Nerd, you can just fuck right off. If you don't seem to get it because of some other reason, let me try and present it to you. But before we dive into the statistics and facts of my presentation on systematic racism, I need to dispel a few myths. Mainly the myths complacent and racist individuals use to dismiss the facts. First, the fake news rhetoric. The fake news rhetoric goes well beyond racism. Yes, this country is littered with fake news. I'll touch on that. But the rhetoric itself is a huge problem because of four big things. First, anybody and everybody can and does have a voice on the internet. Listen to me right now. We're surrounding ourselves with like-minded individuals, whether you want to admit that or not. And many trust those individuals without checking their sources. Second, the older generation has a trust for a news source that they have become comfortable with because of what the news stood for when they were younger. When the limited and liable news sources were reporting to expose a government making poor decisions during and around Vietnam, those news sources didn't report with the attempts for ratings and money, but rather they risked their brand by exposing a government that needed to be exposed. Third, and tied to it, many of those same news sources did find ratings in that reporting though, and much like the rest of the big businesses in a country with deregulated capitalism, those that had the chance to benefit the most by selling out and profiting have definitely done so. So news now moves with one motive, the bottom line. Ratings and ad dollars are not driven by truth, but rather by how many eyes they can attract. They do this knowing they aren't always being truthful too, as proven in the fact Fox News spent the early days of the coronavirus pandemic trying to sell it as a Democrat hoax, while also behind the scenes stopping business travel and limiting those present in the company's office to, here it comes, slow the spread of a deadly and harmful virus. Finally, if Mr. Orange has done anything well since taking over as president, it is to sell this country on the fake news rhetoric. But Iggy, didn't you just say there is fake news? Yes, I did. And yes, there is. But the fake news rhetoric I speak of is the people of this country using it in the same way Trump does. Trump never overused the phrase fake news to shut down actual fake news. He used it to dismiss facts that disagreed with him and his actions. This is how the rest of the country, both conservatives and liberals, are using it. They can dismiss CNN as fake news when it disagrees with their stance, but accept it when it supports their arguments. They can call NPR wrong when it calls us out for our wrongdoings, but go to a site with no news background that has the word conservative or liberal in the title and call that fact. That is the rhetoric, claiming fake news so much that now everybody doubts every news source, specifically the ones they disagree with. So here I am, a new news source for many. I accept that. I accept that I just called out other places that don't have a background or track record. But I'm going to use statistics, facts, with a sprinkle of opinion on top. Data will support what I have to say here, and we will do our best to reference as many sources throughout this podcast. But I will be clear, my opinion on some of these things line up with what many of us out in the real world see with our own two eyes. So when I say sprinkled on top, I mean in a way that when you go to Olive Garden and the person sprinkling the cheese on top of your pasta has a desperate look on his face because it seems as if you'll never tell him to stop. Let's talk All Lives Matter, or what the white person says when we're afraid this racism thing might actually make us have to do something different going forward. According to Wikipedia, the Black Lives Matter response is a response that first began being used shortly after George Zimmerman murdered Trayvon Martin. That was in 2013. But The Guardian outlines in a very good article that they posted shortly after the wrongful death of Michael Brown, noting that the hashtag was used more than 27 million times on Twitter in that time period, really making it a movement post-Ferguson. Black Lives Matter is a phrase that was made when people were trying to say that in order for all lives to matter, Black lives must matter too. But it was quickly tied to violence and hatred of cops and white people by the voices with a platform afraid of this change. Although no accurate study shows a direct correlation with only the Black Lives Matter movement and phrase with violence. But all lives matter is rarely used to combat Black Lives Matter by racists, but rather by those that have been sold on a lie that Black Lives Matter movement is a movement of hate, violence, or black supremacy, making this an even more difficult topic to cover. The prime example here are unnamed family members of mine. They get frustrated and their complacent yet clearly ignorant asses finally speak up, retorting, all lives matter. They think because they think they're not racist, that they are using it in a way that we should all just join hands and stand together against racism when it works for them, of course. But in saying it, especially in response to Black Lives Matter, they are saying that it really means privileged lives matter. You are shutting down the voices that need to be heard right now and equally need to be heard every damn day. With those items out of the way, let's look at the numbers that prove systematic racism is in fact real. Wall Street Journal reporter Heather McDonald, and yes, I said reporter with inflection, published an article shortly after the wrongful death of George Floyd titled "The Myth of Systematic Police Racism." This article clearly had an agenda because it opened by stating in the very first sentence that, quote, Floyd's death revived the Obama-era narrative that law enforcement is racist. Immediately linking black rights to a black president. Immediately linking black to black, not black to all. It does go on to use data, but much like one would expect, the article uses data that only supports its cause and not full data. McDonald's data shows numbers comparing overall deaths at the hands of police, obviously comparing white people to black people. Let's not ignore that she never actually touches on the fact that those numbers are high, no matter the victim, ridiculously high. But she never mentions why those people die. Nothing about the fact that many of those white kids with angst could have been firing on the police while somebody like Breonna Taylor was murdered for sleeping. The real data that McDonald never gets to shows something wildly different. For their book, Suspect Citizen, authors Frank R. Baumgartner, Derek A. Epp, and Kelsey Schaub reviewed 20 million traffic stops. And in an interview with the Washington Post, they shared that they found, quote, blacks are almost twice as likely to be pulled over as whites, even though whites drive more on average. Blacks are more likely to be searched following a stop, and just by getting in a car, a black driver has about twice the odds of being pulled over and about 4 times the odds of being searched, end quote. This is supported by a 2013 Justice Department study that found black and Latino drivers are more likely to be searched once they have been pulled over. About 2% of white motorists were searched once pulled over versus 6% of black drivers and 7% of Latinos. And according to the Justice Department, between 2012 and 2014, black people in Ferguson, Missouri accounted for 85% of all vehicle stops. That's the same Ferguson, Missouri, and the same time window where Martin was murdered. This is not limited to Ferguson, Missouri, though. Another Justice Department study found similar data in other towns, like in the town of Florissant, where 71% of the motorists pulled over by the police in 2013 were black, even though they only made up 25% of the town's population. It was only further supported with numbers from Kansas City's public radio when they shared a study that stated blacks were 2.7 times more likely to be pulled over in an investigatory stop. The ACLU Foundation of Massachusetts found that 63% of frisk incidents in Boston were conducted on black people. And a 2017 study of interactions between officers and citizens taken from the footage captured by police officers' body cameras found that, quote, officers speak with consistently less respect towards black versus white community members, even after controlling for the race of the officer, the severity of the infraction, the location of the stop, and the outcome of the stop, end quote. A 2015 statistical analysis using the U.S. Police Shooting Database, their own database, showed that police shootings from 2011 to 2014 found that the racial disparity in those police shootings of black people could not be explained by higher crime rates in majority black communities. And a 2018 Washington Post investigation found that murders of white people are more likely to be solved than murders of black people. There's also a strong correlation between areas that are black majority and low income and the areas with the lowest clearance rates for homicide. This extends beyond police just singling out minorities. This extends to the war on drugs, where data from New York City showed that black people are arrested for marijuana at 8 times the rate of white people. The all lives matter argument regarding drugs may be that blacks are more likely to be arrested because they're more likely to use drugs in public. But a 2002 study of narcotics search warrants in the San Diego area, meaning warrants to search for drugs in private homes, found that black and Hispanic residents were, quote, significantly overrepresented as targets of narcotics search warrants, end quote, even after adjusting for usage rates. Should we even touch on the racism of the president and how Trump's America has supported an increase in these hate crimes, racial violence, and police brutality? Hell, let's do it. Supported by a study by the Chronicle of Higher Education, after Trump's presidential victory in 2016, hate crimes on college campuses increased a drastic 25%, while the FBI itself reported a 5% increase of hate crimes against minorities nationwide, including a staggering 67% increase against the Muslim community. Let me repeat, these statistics were found and displayed on the FBI's site, not a news site, leading us to very clearly see the fact that the current administration is standing on a belief of white supremacy. And if you think it's not a direct correlation, look further into Trump himself, his own speeches, his tweets, his retweets, something no fake news network has to change in order to gain ratings or mislead anybody, because they're from his mouth directly. This doesn't even begin to touch on the data conducted by private organizations, Pulitzer Prize-winning local and national newspapers, internal departments, cities, and large government investigations that prove disproportionate numbers in situations of legal sentencing and the use of the death penalty, discrepancy in numbers of white students to black students in regards to school suspensions and the school-to-prison pipeline, the fact more blacks spend time in incarceration and solitary confinement per capita, and the discrepancies found in awarded bail, pre-trial detention, commutations and pardons, the difference in wages between educated and non-educated white and black people in the workforce, lower government funding towards minority-heavy communities and minority-targeted organizations or funds, a complete lack of funding in some states and even a huge fucking gaping discrepancy in health coverage and the costs associated with it. Holy shit, people! Last but not least to note is the government's own education site has an entire presentation to help us better understand how, quote, institutional racism and other forms of bias affects educational experiences of students from marginalized communities, end quote, on the government site itself. And I get it. If you're defensive, you can now shift the argument to that it's not always about race. Our system is broken, and in so many ways, it is. And the overuse of police force goes beyond impacting just minority communities, but it targets them. But let's look at the overall number if you want to try to pull race out of it, and let's talk about the problem with police. The overuse of force is so common in our country's policing that the Wall Street Journal, yep, the same Wall Street Journal McDonald writes for, reported that cities with the 10 largest police forces paid out over $1.02 billion in settlements over the span of just 5 years. These settlements were reached because there were cases in which it was proven an officer or group of officers crossed the line in doing their job. That's a lot of fucking money, over $1 billion. And remember, these settlements only pay out after a long legal battle in which somebody was able to prove wrongdoing, something so incredibly difficult due to qualified immunity. Now, the removal of qualified immunity is actually going through the House with bipartisan support, so I won't spend too much time on it. But one might think, even with that in place or not, the amount of excess force or brutality used is way too high, just considering that payout. But how can our voices sway elected officials impacting that? This takes me back again to Trump, the person in charge of the administration that can issue what is called a consent decree. So a consent decree, in the case of police force, is a decree that is intended to promote police integrity within the department and prevent conduct that deprives individuals of their rights, privileges, or immunities protected by the Constitution of the United States. And they stem from investigations that only the Justice Department, acting on behalf of the current president's administration, can conduct. In George W. Bush's first term as president, his Justice Department launched 12 such investigations into police departments, while Obama's first term saw 15 investigations. And with Trump, we've seen one investigation that was, of course, quickly dismissed, resulting in no consent decree. Again, these numbers are directly from the Justice Department, not from a news source. This shouldn't come as a surprise because Trump sees police and military force as a sign of strength and uses it often to flex to the world and apparently to Americans that this is his power and he has the right to use it. Something he continues to threaten to us Americans right now. Not just looters, not just rioters, but even the peaceful protesters that are in the streets. Now listen, I get it. I'm privileged. I'm a 35-year-old white male living in a nice home in the suburbs. I have the capability to choose taking this topic on, or I could have just gone and posted another sitcom reunion possibility on the site. I can turn off the news once this becomes overwhelming, or I can deactivate my Facebook account to stop seeing my extended family's complacent bullshit. But the fact that I can say any of that is the very reason we need to take action now. Marginalized communities need allies, not saviors, but allies to help support their cause. And anybody can call out a racist stranger or unfriend a racist piece of shit. But we need strong allies in this that call out the people we know, even ourselves at times, for complacency and lack of action. Allies like Project Nerd's own Adam Adair.
We definitely talked about it this week, and I've been thinking about it and trying to figure it out. And so, I need to write this down so I can get all of my thoughts out in a way that makes sense. It will also keep me from being angry the whole time I try to talk about it. I know people don't respond well to anger or, quote, I just can't listen to someone who is angry. You hear that all the time. So let me start off by saying, I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. That's right. You're about to get a dad lecture. I'm disappointed that it's 2020 and it's still considered a radical idea that everyone deserves to be treated equally. I'm disappointed that it's 2020 and that racial equality is somehow a political topic. I'm disappointed that people gaslight anyone who says Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter, like trying to protect minorities or drawing attention to the problems of minorities means you don't care about everyone else. I'm disappointed that people think racial issues in the United States like they are things from our past. I'm disappointed that some white people are willfully ignorant of their privilege their skin color affords them. This doesn't mean your life isn't hard. It just means that your skin color doesn't make it any harder. I'm disappointed that there are people still alive who couldn't use a public drinking fountain because of the color of their skin, and painfully disappointed that those same people have to watch all of this still going on. I'm disappointed that people will use riots and looting as a way to discredit all the protesters in one breath and scream at the top of their lungs with the next breath that a few bad cops don't ruin the whole bunch. I'm disappointed that people are quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a way to discredit the protesters without even a hint of irony, using the words of a famous protester, maybe the most famous protester, to discredit protesting as an idea that makes my mind and my heart hurt. But Adam, you say, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was only in favor of peaceful protests, not riots and looting. And you're correct. Way back in the 1960s, before he was assassinated for thinking that Black people and all people of color should be treated equally to white people, he said just those things. But imagine how he would feel knowing that if he had stayed alive, he would have to spend the next 52 years of his life protesting the idea that cops shouldn't kill people of color without repercussions. His would be a righteous anger and fury if that were the case. But mostly I'm disappointed in myself. I'm disappointed that I don't have the energy to be angry about all of these things all of the time. I'm disappointed that I use my privilege to be able to escape these issues when I should use it to protest and to help explain them. I'm disappointed that I can ignore these issues and my life is easier, that I can simply not read a comment section because I know it's going to be full of hatred and awfulness. I'm disappointed that I don't have the courage to spend every hour of every day calling you out on your bullshit. I want to be better, and I'm disappointed that I allow you to be the reason that I'm not.
As Adam mentioned in a speech that brought me to tears during our recording of the Nerdcast this last week, that we have to hold ourselves accountable, and we should be disappointed in ourselves as well as others. And no matter how progressive, how much we've seen with our own eyes, or how much we say we understand, we as allies have no fucking idea what marginalized communities, especially the Black community, have to deal with when driving, sleeping, using their phone, buying something, or even just living. This brings me to my last point. What's happening on the streets right now? Peaceful protests are making up the majority of what we are seeing out there. And as much as those defending the system and police can say it's violence from the protesting side instigating the use of tear gas and force, we are seeing the complete opposite with our own eyes from videos and unedited live streams. You would think in a case where we're trying to prove that there is not police brutality, the police would stop beating the shit out of people on camera. Let's not even mention the videos and streams of police officers clearly and without being provoked, driving through groups of peaceful protesters, destroying water and medic stations, and even firing rubber bullets and pepper spray into groups that include children. Again, something we are being told isn't happening, with Trump actually saying, quote, "What you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening," end quote. Yes, seriously, he said that. This is something straight out of a dystopian novel we never thought we'd see. And quoting 1984, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." But even with all of that, from my place of privilege, I have stated internally and to other friends that I can't get behind the use of violence, especially coming from violence. Even though I refuse to condemn those actions as I don't understand, I couldn't get behind it, and I just didn't get it. That was at least until I listened to Kimberly Jones, as she definitely helped me get a better place of understanding.
So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning a fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
Let me make this extremely clear. Project Nerd and myself are not in support of violence of any kind. But what I'm saying, and what I hope you got from Kimberly Jones, is that specifically regarding the protesters' roles in the riots and looting, because let us not lose sight that a big part of that rioting and looting are the outsiders and racists trying to take away from the original message, that again, the protesters' role in it, I get it now. I understand. But even understanding, this is still not enough. I honestly, at this point, don't have a series of great answers here to close with. I think the most important thing we can do as allies is to just shut down the complacent rhetoric, even if it's coming from loved ones, especially when it's coming from loved ones. But then we have to listen. Listen to what the black community and other marginalized communities need us to do going forward. Not just right now, but going forward. Most importantly, we must vote. Vote the racist, vote the complacent, and vote the corrupt out now. This summer, in November, and every year after. Because that will be the biggest display of power and support any of us can show. Even though you and I may be able to breathe fine every day without a knee on our neck, we should be furious that our neighbors may not be able to. And especially at this point, anything short of acting on that is just not acceptable. That's it for this episode of Diving Deep.